today's session. We are, in only a few years, New Zealand sector has rapidly recognised the call to action to address climate change, and with legislation, standard setters creating standards, and regulators overseeing and providing guidance, we have a world-first climate-related disclosures regime. So whilst many here today, I'm sure, will be keen to hear what the FMA has thought of the first CRD reporting, are there more standards coming? We also hope that you will leave today thinking more about the opportunities of where the regime has been, where in your organisation can take all that's been done and learnt, and how we as an industry can use CRD to drive better decision making within organisations and contribute to achieving New Zealand's climate targets. From disclosure, we are recognising that we have just started. There are other areas of disclosure beyond climate, nature, human capital, and today we'll explore the role of a green or sustainable finance taxonomy in enabling capital allocation so we can achieve sustainable outcomes. Throughout the session, you have the ability to ask questions of our panel through the mobile app, which will come through in live time, or feel free to raise your hand and I can float around with a microphone and you can ask them that way. So whatever you feel comfortable with. And with that, I will hand over to our facilitator, Daniel Street, to introduce our panel.
Thanks, Carissa. Kia ora koutou, ko Daniel Street, toko ingoa. So I am a partner at DLA Piper and ESG lead for New Zealand, as well as one of our international leads for sustainability, reporting, disclosure and marketing. So I am joined on our panel today by Joe Kelly, Chief Executive of the Centre of Sustainable Finance, Toitu Tahua, Dr. Amelia Sharman, who's Director of Sustainability Reporting at the External Reporting Board, and Michael van Zijl, who's Acting Manager of Climate-Related Disclosures at the Financial Markets Authority. So I'm going to start by just saying a few words and then I'll hand over to each of the panellists to give themselves a bit more of an introduction and some opening comments. So, as Carissa points out, this is a very timely session, so we're sort of 64 months now from 2030, so we are on continuing the countdown through to 2030 and on this process of systemic change across not only our financial systems but across our economy in New Zealand to get to a lower carbon, more resilient future. We are in a process of rapidly deploying a number of tools in order for us to get there, both on the reporting front, on the sustainable finance front, and on the various levers that we are pulling on action in order to reduce our absolute emissions. So I think this is a very timely chance to discuss where we are, as we are sort of, as people like to say, building and testing the machine and trying to develop the machine as we're all going. So a sort of process of continuous improvement. So there's a number of sort of main topics that we're going to cover off in today's session. One is sort of key themes that we're drawing from the initial sets of climate statements and initial reports. Two, trans-Tasman developments, so both in the sustainability reporting and in the sustainable finance space, and the sort of interaction between Australian and New Zealand developments here, the areas of collaboration, the areas where we're not so aligned, and where we see the path forward. The development of New Zealand's, or the Aotearoa, sustainable finance taxonomy and the progress that we're making in that space. And then we'd like to end with some sort of practical advice and takeaways for people in this room, recognising the sort of unique challenges and opportunities faced by the financial services sector as we move through this phase. So as Carissa said, we're open to questions as we go through, putting them through the app. We also have a sort of number of questions that we will wrap up at the end. But with that, I will hand over to each of our panellists to introduce themselves. So, Joe, do you want to start?
Joe Kelly, Chief Executive of the Centre for Sustainable Finance. So, some of you may be familiar with the Centre. For those who aren't, we're not a standard setter or a regulator. We're a charitable trust and we sit between the government and financial institutions. And we sort of have a mandate from our private sector partners to work on the settings, I suppose, that enable sustainable finance. When I talk about sustainable finance, what I mean is finance, to sustainable development. So it's not the kind of the product or service that we might have, sort of the team, the tiny team in the bank that does the green bonds, for example. It's the reallocation at scale of capital to sustainable development activities. And so we think about the mainstream frameworks that we need to do that, so everybody can participate in that. And then, so that's the taxonomies and the kind of data infrastructure. And then we also think about the more kind of bespoke or specific settings and activities we need, which might be things like the particular settings around KiwiSaver investment into private assets, let's say. So, yeah, that's the centre.
Thanks, Jo. Kia ora koutou. I'm Amelia Sharman from the External Reporting Board, who is your friendly neighbourhood standard setter. So, as I think you all know, so we set standards for financial reporting, audit and assurance, and climate standards, and we have this additional mandate on non-binding guidance on non-financial reporting. So that was added to our mandate at the same time as the climate standards mandate. And we also set standards for the public, private, and not-for-profit sectors. So we're really unusual in that sense that we do all of that mahi. In other countries, often that standard setting work is split off into different agencies. So I think we're really, really lucky that we have it collaboratively, because it means if we have, any discussions about what we're all doing, we can do it internally. And so, as you all know, we issued the climate standards a couple of years ago. We are, responsible for setting the rules. We are not about compliance. That's Michael. But we're really, really interested in making sure that the intent of the climate standards is met. And I'm really pleased Daniel mentioned, this is a piece of New Zealand climate policy. Standards in this field, climate, sustainability, etc., are definitely pieces of jurisdictional environmental or social or governance policy. They're designed to achieve certain goals. So, for example, the European standards are designed to support the European Green Deal. In New Zealand, this is designed to support our net zero framework. So we have a mandate to set the standards, but also in our legislative mandate, we do have a mandate to liaise nationally and internationally, because a lot of this work is done at various international board level, other international jurisdictions, as well as what's happening here in New Zealand. So we have a close eye on what's happening in Aotearoa New Zealand, but we also work a lot with other standard setters, so I'm very happy to answer any questions about that.
Thank you. Yeah, so my name's Michael van Zijl, and I'm the acting manager of the climate-related disclosures team at the FMA, as Daniel mentioned. So our role in relation to this regime is that we're the independent agency responsible for monitoring and enforcing the regime. So a big part of that obviously is reviewing climate statements to see that they comply with the standards that the XRB has issued, as well as all the requirements in Part 7A of the Financial Markets Conduct Act as well, being the primary legislation. We also work to sort of right-size the regime and sort of reduce regulatory burden where appropriate. So we have issued a number of class exemptions in relation to CRD, as well as have progressed, I think, just under a dozen individual exemptions so far as well, and are working with entities on some more at the moment as well. In terms of our regulatory approach, so last year in June we released our monitoring plan, which details how we're going to approach the regulation of this regime. The headline message here, which I'm sure some of you may have heard before, is that we're taking this educative and constructive approach. What that means is when we identify issues in climate statements, the first response is going to be to engage with the entities, the sector that the entities are in, or the whole population, to provide feedback and guidance to improve disclosure, rather than sort of opt for our more sort of standard regulatory tools that we use in more established regimes. However, that doesn't mean that we won't take enforcement action where it's appropriate. So we're thinking around serious misconduct, we will still take enforcement action in the early years. In terms of our approach for the first year reporting, we're aiming to review as many climate statements as possible. It's quite an ambitious goal, but we're still hoping to get there. On the back of that, we may reach out to entities individually. So that will be through either through a letter or an email, and that will be to either provide really targeted, specific feedback to that entity, or to sort of understand the disclosures in more detail. But in any case, we're going to be releasing a monitoring report in November this year, which details our findings at a thematic level. Cool, that's me.
Excellent. I'll just add on to Michael's point there that from my personal experience, the FMA have been very, very easy to deal with on the specific exemption front, having helped a few clients get through that process in relation to their climate statements for the first year. And the FMA has been incredibly constructive and positive in dealing with those exemptions. So as we start off and we're talking about the climate statements that have been issued so far, Amelia and Michael, as standard setter and regulator, what can you tell us at this stage about the climate statements that have been published so far? And do you have any guidance for those looking to work through and read those statements themselves?
Yeah, sure. I'll talk to the first part of that question, and I might pass to Amelia for the guidance we released recently. So we've completed all of our reviews for the December and January year ends. We're making our way through all the March year ends. That's all the entities and all the schemes with March year ends. We've completed some, but we're not really through enough yet to provide any kind of thematic findings on those schemes. So I'm really just going to touch on the first cohort, being the December, January year ends. So far, I mean, I think the headline thing here is that overall we're actually quite pleased with the approach and the entities have taken to the regime to embed it at quite a really fast pace. There's been a lot of different approaches, different presentation styles, but overall, from what we can tell from the disclosure, that entities have taken this seriously. They've put a lot of time and effort into preparing them. So, want to commend entities for that. However, that doesn't mean that there's not areas for improvement, and we are going to be raising our expectations over time. It'll be a gradual raising of expectations. And to uplift the quality of reporting and improve reporting, we're looking at a couple of different tools. I've touched on two of those already around sending emails or sending letters. The other one is obviously the monitoring report as well. In terms of some specific observations around areas for improvement, there are a couple I'm going to talk to. The first one is around methods, assumptions, data, and estimation uncertainty. So across the board, we did see a lot of entities sort of not going into enough detail or not disclosing anything around all the methods and assumptions that underpin their disclosures. So specifically for the greenhouse gas disclosures as well as the scenario analysis disclosures. So really want to stress the importance of NZCS3 here. There are specific disclosure requirements in that standard. I think it's from around paragraph 47 onwards. So really want to encourage entities to review that. And remember, there are disclosure requirements in NZCS3. And helpfully, the XRB actually produced a video, I think it was in June, Amelia? July, maybe, June or July, that talks about NZCS3. So I encourage you again to watch that. It's only 5 minutes long, but it's a great summary. The other, another observation is around assurance. So we did see, it was pleasantly surprising to see some entities had gone out and got voluntary assurance in year one for their GHG emissions. And they disclosed that they had voluntary assurance, but what most entities didn't do was then make that practitioner's report available. So we really wanted to make the point that if you're going to get voluntary assurance and you're going to disclose that you've had it in year one, make the practitioner's report available as well publicly. Provides all the context for users to understand the level of engagement, the scope of the work, the opinion, etc. So it's really important information. Another thing we want to touch on is around reporting gaps. So specifically for the metrics and targets disclosures, mainly around the amount or percentage of assets or business activities vulnerable to climate-related risks or aligned to climate-related opportunities. We did see a lot of entities were struggling to disclose that, and we just do want to stress if you can't meet your disclosure requirements in year 1 or 2 or 3, etc., just be upfront about it, acknowledge it, say why you couldn't comply with it and what you're going to do to address that and going forward. It was really good to see that some entities did take that approach and were upfront about the gap, but others didn't. So just again stress, acknowledge the reporting gaps and state why you couldn't do it. And the last thing I was going to touch on was around a couple of things in the strategy pillar. So around current climate-related impacts, one thing we've been seeing that we want people to improve on is they'll disclose that a climate-related event happened, in the period, but they won't explain or disclose what the impact of that was on them. So, for example, we saw disclosure that Cyclone Gabrielle happened or the Auckland anniversary flooding events occurred, but there was no disclosure about what that meant for the entity. What impact did that have at all on the entity? And if you don't have any, climate-related impacts in the current period, just disclose that. You don't need to say that event happened without providing the full context. Next thing is around climate-related risks and opportunities and the link to capital deployment. So there are a number of disclosures there that sort of draw out those links. And we, across the board, we did see quite vague and incomplete disclosure in that regard. One example was, disclosure around how climate-related risks and opportunities are an input into capital allocation decisions internally. We saw disclosure, around saying things like these decisions are made in favour of sustainability, which is quite vague and incomplete, doesn't really tell you the full picture. How is it actually informing those decisions? So make sure you do provide the detail. Again, if there's no link, then just disclose that there's no link currently. And then lastly, on scenario analysis, this is one area we did think that entities were going to struggle with in the early years. It's quite a complex exercise and it's new for a lot of entities. But some common issues we did see coming through around that were a lot of entities have done, focused really heavily on disclosure of the process that they've followed to create or develop or construct, whatever word you want to use, their climate-related scenarios. But then the disclosure about how they analysed them, what they did to actually, identify how resilient their business model and strategy was to those three scenarios or more, was really limited or not there at all. So just really want to stress the importance that the process of how you've actually analysed the scenarios is equally important as the process you've done to develop them, and really important information for users as well.
Thanks, Michael. I always say NZCS3 is my favourite standard. It's not the showy NZCS1 with the disclosure requirements. It's not the nice, not easy, NZCS2, with the transition provisions, but it is super important. There, as Michael said, there are disclosure requirements in there, and those disclosure requirements are really about helping entities, if you are a climate reporting entity, to explain the uncertainty, to explain the estimation, etc., that you've used, and they are also really important disclosure requirements for the user to know, what it is that they're looking at, how can they understand it. And then NZCS3 also has the principles, and these are, under an overarching principle of fair presentation, and there are specific information and presentation principles in NZCS3, and those are designed to, make it easier for disclosures to be comparable, or make sure that they're complete. And one that we particularly noticed was this idea of coherence. So I'll just use that as an example. So the coherence principle is about making sure that the information is coherent within the reporting, the climate statement, but also across the reporting that you're doing. So into your financial statements. So if you are saying in your financial statements you had a massive loss or something, and then it's not reflected in your climate statements, or vice versa, obviously there's different recognition and measurement criteria for financial reporting, but that coherence principle is really, really important. And yes, we did do a little video. It is really short. All it is, the key message I'd leave you with that is just read that standard. Don't forget about it. It's really important. In terms of our views on what the disclosures are looking like, as Michael said, really, really pleased to see the effort that's gone into those, and we do not want to underestimate the effort. Particularly pleased to see where entities are clear that the point of this is a strategy tool. This is designed to be a strategy tool for entities to better understand their risks and opportunities so that they can make better decisions. Because this is really important. In our primary legislation, the purpose of climate statements is not just about investor decision making. That is really important. It's in there, but it is also about enabling entities themselves to make better decisions around their own risks and opportunities. And that's why the standards have a purpose statement in them. It is about allocating capital to activities consistent with that low emissions, climate resilient future. And that capital is internal capital, your own, capital that you decide to allocate, and as well as external investor capital. So, I really want to make sure that you understand that we see, the fund managers, you in the room, you are preparers and users of this information. And we really want to make sure that it is, useful for you, A, as a strategy tool, and B, to get the information that you need to make your decisions. And so we are really, really keen to hear from you about which bits of the standard you think are not working in that respect. We've always said we will begin an early post-implementation review of the climate standards. We've said by December 2025, but we wanted to give ourselves some flexibility as to when that would start based on what was going on. So we're really keen to hear if you think that it's not meeting, the requirements that you need to make good decisions, or it's actually we're asking for information that you are not able to provide. That's information we need. We're definitely aware. One of the options that we have as a standard setter is what's called differential reporting. So in financial reporting, you'll be aware of this. This is through the tiers. So different sizes of entities can have different disclosure requirements. And, we are absolutely able to have differential reporting for different types of entities. So something we really are aware of is whether or not we may need to do differential reporting for fund managers vis-a-vis other types of entities, particularly given the requirement in primary legislation for fund level reporting. So we're very, very aware of that, and that's on our mind. And as Michael said, so we are really also very keen, as well as providing information about the regime, to everyone who asks, so we don't get inundated with 1,000 questions every day about who's a climate reporting entity. We've also done some joint guidance. So one is on that basics of the regime, and the other one is it's called Navigating Climate Statements. And I do have some hard copies, which I printed. I never print hard copies, but if you want to come and get one. I've got 4. Come get one from me later on. And the point of this guide is to really explain that climate reporting is different from financial reporting. It is not going to have the same level of comparability. It's not going to have the same level of certainty as financial reporting. And there's definitely a whole lot of stuff that we've explained in here about understanding, context when you're analysing an entity's performance. How can you make use of this information that's in the climate reports, because it isn't, it hasn't had the decades-long experience of financial reporting, and the fundamental nature of the information is different. So there's definitely a whole lot of judgment around that uncertainty, etc., that, when you're reading a climate statement that you need to know to enable you to make, good decisions and use that. So we really hope that guidance is helpful. But again, we are absolutely watching what's happening in other jurisdictions around A, the guidance that they're putting out, and B, the approaches that they're taking to setting their standards. And I can, talk about that in the next question.
Excellent. Thank you very much, both. That's some very detailed feedback and some very useful reflections on the style of the regime. I also will shout out that 5-minute video. It was a very sort of timely reminder of and advert for NZCS3 when it came out. So, Amelia, just on that last point, what impact do you think the arrival of the Australian climate reporting regime will have for New Zealand entities? So we're now at the point in Australia where the Senate has passed the bill. It's going back to the House. The House next sits 7 September, 9 September, I think is the next sitting day of the House of Representatives. And it's expected to quickly pass into law once the House begins sitting again, and then the AASB shortly to finalise their standards once the legislation has passed. So what impact do you think we'll see for New Zealand entities? Will we see further alignment, and what are the benefits of having a distinctly Aotearoa regime?
To be honest, I think it can only be a good thing. I think having disclosure requirements in Australia, which are, to all intents and purposes, very aligned with what we have in New Zealand, is great, because it means there'll be better information available in New Zealand. Everyone will be able to be speaking a common language. So the standards that Australia is basing their standard off are the International Sustainability Standards Board S2, which is the climate one, which they will be their mandatory standard, and then they will also be publishing S1, which is the General Sustainability Standard, as a voluntary standard in Australia. And that that S2 standard did come out in draft form before we finalised our standards here in New Zealand. So we did manage to, do some alignment at that point to make sure that there's no unnecessary differences there. So we've published a comparison between the international standards and the New Zealand standards. We think that they are very aligned. The difference is in the level of detail that the international standard has. So we estimate, that there are about 50 additional disclosure requirements in that international S2 standard that we don't have, and then we have about 10 that they don't have. And an example, so for Michael was talking about the scenario analysis. The S2 standard has a requirement to disclose a resilience assessment. So you've done all of your work on scenario analysis, and then you have to disclose how resilient you are. We don't have that disclosure requirement purposefully because we thought that if we had that disclosure requirement, people might not do challenging enough scenario analysis because they don't want to kind of go out there in public and say, hey, I'm not very resilient after all of this, what I've learned. So, there are differences. There are also, we don't have a lot of the metrics and targets disclosures. Interestingly, we've seen some pricing for some AI tools to help people do disclosure requirements against both standards, and ours is half the cost of the international one, mostly around the fact that we don't have a lot of those metrics and targets disclosures. So so Australia, we will be publishing an interoperability guide. We've aiming to do that within 3 months of the AASB passing their standards, just to help people understand what they might need to do additionally. I will point out, as I said, the Australian policy position published by the Treasury focuses on investor decision making as the sole purpose of their regime. We have investor decision-making as one of the purposes of our regime. It is not the only purpose. So there are differences in the intent of what these disclosure regimes are intending to achieve. But we are absolutely aware that there are a lot of trans-Tasman businesses and they want alignment. What we are also aware is that there are a lot of entities operating into Europe and operating into the US and operating into China, and all of these places have their own disclosure requirements. So we are very aware about international alignment, but we do want to, stress that for us, when we look at international alignment, it is the globe, because there is a lot happening, and we want to make sure that what we're doing is going to help entities who are exporting into those places, etc. That is the reason why our standard is flexible and principles based. It is designed to, in essence, kind of nest, if you will, under some of the more prescriptive disclosure requirements, because you should be able to use a lot of the disclosure requirements in New Zealand to meet the disclosure requirements in other places. It won't always be perfect. Europe has this double materiality approach, which is about impact outwards as well as impact in. We only have impact in. Australia only has impact in. But, these are all decisions and changes that are happening and on our mind. And the benefits of having distinctly Aotearoa New Zealand regime, again, we designed it for the entities that have to report. In Australia, some public sector entities are going to be captured. They're going to be doing some public sector requirements. They have a lot of entities captured. They're called Group 1, 2 and 3. 20,000. We have we have about 200. So we are very aware that maybe, as I said before, differential reporting, there might need to be alignment at some types of entities across Australia and New Zealand. But, for example, Europe is doing standards for their SMEs, small and medium enterprises. We're really watching that very closely because, as you all know, New Zealand entities on an international scale are SMEs often. And so, what does that look like? But it is still a very rapidly moving international landscape.
Thank you very much, Amelia. So, as you'd expect, one of the first questions we always get from our international clients is, are we captured? What parts of our business are captured? Even before we then start looking at what the standards require us to do. Clients are certainly appreciating the efforts the regulators are taking from an exemptions point of view or an international engagement view to work out how entities can reuse or repurpose reporting in different jurisdictions to meet different requirements?
I definitely say, we're very aware that entities can be captured through multiple mechanisms. You can be captured through a regulatory mechanism. So, for example, Europe, if you do enough business in Europe, you have to report, even if you are not located there. So that is going to capture some New Zealand entities because they do enough business in Europe. You can be captured through a trade requirement. So there are definitely trade agreement, trade rules that require disclosure in this area. And then we're aware there are those non-regulatory or non-trade ways in which you can be captured, and that's through an investor ask or it's through a supplier contract. And these are coming from an entity that is dealing into an international supply chain. So there are lots of asks coming from lots of places, and we really want to be helpful that our standards in New Zealand, A, enable you to make better decisions, but B, also enable you to provide information up into those other channels.
Excellent. Joe, I want to turn to you now. So similarly, what's the likely impact of Australia's sustainable finance developments on the side of the Tasman? So my impression, Australia's gone from 0 to 100 in about the last 18 months in terms of progress on sustainable finance and developments in this space. Can you tell us about sort of developments in Australia, the collaboration with the centre, and what the impacts we can see for New Zealand?
Yeah, sure. I think on a big picture level, so I won't talk specifically about the Australian disclosures, but certainly the Australian government, when it came in, moved really quickly with the support of the Australian Sustainable Finance Institute to implement a lot of the beginnings of, frameworks to support this, large-scale mobilisation of capital. So ASFI, the Australian Sustainable Finance Institute, is sort of the counterpart to the centre there, and they're leading out on the Australian taxonomy. They also had a lot of involvement with the Australian Sustainable Finance Roadmap, which has just been published by the Australian Treasury, which has a lot of other aspects of sustainable finance covered in it, such as product labelling, for example. And so ASFI has helped the government to move really quickly. They are developing taxonomies for 6 transition sectors. Shall I talk about what is a taxonomy?
Please do.
Feels like a good place to start. Show of hands, anyone in the room who feels like relatively quickly, without a ton of time or cost, you could identify a green or transition activity in agriculture or forestry for the purpose of capital allocation to that Exactly.
Resounding show of hands.
So, yeah, no hands, right? So that's, for New Zealand, that's what the sort of the promise of the taxonomy project is. It's essentially a classification system. It's a way of understanding credibly what is a green or a transition activity in a key sector. And what that does is it sort of democratises access to those activities and to decision making related to those activities. So then you don't need that specialist function to the same degree as you might have previously or in the absence of an agreed framework. And I think an important thing to understand is that these are already in use at an organisational level in New Zealand. So as we all know, people who make decisions about how to allocate capital here have internal decision-making frameworks, and they exist. They're kind of developed internally without, it's hard to know really what level of integrity, rigor, kind of input, scrutiny they've been put through. And so having a taxonomy that's supported by the government but developed with a lot of input from industry is a way of making transparent and making credible the development of those frameworks that then a much broader group of people can use. So there's about 50 or so taxonomies in development globally. What does that tell us? It tells us that governments and countries want to tell their own sustainability story, but they want to do it in a way that's recognisable to sort of global markets. And so does that create fragmentation? Maybe. right? Is there possibility for some regulatory arbitrage? Maybe, but that will change over time, and there's sort of an effort to make sure that there's methodological alignment, even if there's sort of, jurisdictional nuance. And so with the centre, in terms of how we approach this with Australia and globally, we have... We've sort of been pleased that the Minister for Climate Change over the last few weeks has announced a taxonomy in New Zealand initially for ag and forestry, and we'll be working with officials to develop that taxonomy, and that is largely, it's unlike our kind of government colleagues who are the standard setters, that's much more of an industry government kind of joined up process. And we have always started from the position of what is happening in Australia with their taxonomies that doesn't work for New Zealand. So we've had the benefit, unlike the disclosures, of actually quite slowly following what's happening with taxonomies globally. And so Australia's Sustainable Finance Institute started in 2021, which is when the centre was also stood up. And probably the third conversation I had was with their establishment chief exec. And from there, we have been sharing information and talking about how to develop, a trans-Tasman kind of approach to taxonomies since well before the government had committed to doing it. So that has been obviously really beneficial to the way that we've thought about the process. There's a lot of efficiencies because they're doing the hard yards at the moment of consultation and kind of learning what good looks like from the point of view of, how much engagement for how long on this stuff before you have to just make a call. These are the criteria and these are the thresholds and this is what we're doing. So there's a lot, that we've taken on board there. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. One of the things that I sort of reflect on with taxonomies and thinks is very useful with my lawyer's hat on is that it gives that common language and it gives that sense of certainty and a bit of confidence that when you're talking about what you are doing in this space, you can do it without risk of greenwashing because you're sitting there with a common language and everybody knows that if you use this particular term and you're talking about a particular taxonomy, then you're applying a particular set of standards. And so it should reduce friction and unease in that respect.
Yeah, I'll just point everyone to our website, sustainablefinance.nz, and on there are the recommendations. So the first thing the Climate Change Minister did, to his credit, was say, put forward some advice to us on what this taxonomy should include. Like, what are the kind of key design considerations? What's its purpose, etc. So those are summarised. They're summarised and they're available in full on our website. What are the key things to know? The purpose is about mobilising and directing capital. The initial recommendation is that it's a voluntary framework. It's not a compliance exercise because of that purpose. And really importantly, what we're saying, unlike the kind of where Europe started, is that in New Zealand, the appropriate approach is to have green and transition activities covered in the taxonomy. So what does a credible transition activity look like within what kind of period of time for any given sector before it has to either, become green or sort of stop happening. So if you think about agriculture, these are really important things to think through before you actually start developing the criteria. And so all of those recommendations are available.
Yeah, that transition finance piece is a key focus of the Australian and New Zealand regimes and a key benefit compared to many of the international taxonomies. Because if we're talking about actually affecting change, bringing along decarbonisation, what we need to have is to continue to have that transition finance with a sense of rigour and a time frame, as you say, of how quickly are we going to allow or how long do we give people to make that transition. So I think that is a very good credit of our regime that we have in development. So what I'd like to do as a sort of end before we move on to the Q&A part of proceedings is I'd like to end with sort of each panellist giving one practical takeaway that they have for attendees today, whether or not that's for preparing for year 2 of their climate reporting or preparing for adopting and using the RTRR Sustainable Finance Taxonomy. So I might start with Michael at the end of the row.
Thank you. I've got two bits of practical advice. The first one is
I don't know if we can allow that.
Okay. Is just making sure you're having conversations with your assurance practitioner now to so you understand what that's going to look like for next year. It's quite a big undertaking. So if you haven't already, start those conversations now. And then also on the same vein, start thinking about those adoption provisions, disclosures around transition planning or quantifying financial impacts. So start thinking about those, get ready for them if you haven't done already.
Mine is just talk to each other. You know, there are a whole lot of people doing this work inside of entities, and we're all going to get better if we all have better conversations with each other. So reach out to your colleagues in other organisations. It's really that collaborate to compete model. You know, we are all struggling sometimes with difficult things and understanding what to do. And the more that we can do it together, I really honestly think that we will make better progress.
Stay the course. It's not going anywhere. It's painful at the moment, no doubt, but it's not an option for New Zealand not to do this. So will things converge over time? Sure. Will there be AI-enabled tools over time? Sure. Will there be better data over time? Sure. It's probably a bunch of Excel sheets now, and it's really annoying, but business as usual is over, right? It's not an option. So just stay the course, build the muscle, compete. The reason companies and countries are doing this is to compete for capital. So just keep going. And there's noise. You know, new government, should we walk this back? Is this putting our private companies at an advantage over listed companies? Is it putting New Zealand companies at a disadvantage against Australian companies, et cetera, et cetera? Like, it's not an option, right? This stuff starts in Europe and North America, and it flows down the value chain to us. So just keep going and get better. I mean, against yourself, not, improve, I guess, is the word I was looking for,
Yeah, I completely echo that last point. So sort of my personal reflection is that we're at the moment of sort of coming into the moment of peak cost and peak difficulty, and we're yet to see the benefits because there is a lag of benefit, because we only get the benefit once we've implemented the regime, we start getting the allocation of capital moving around, and then we start seeing the benefits of the new regime once it's bedded in. So definitely stay the course. With all forms of growth, you've got to get through that moment of difficulty, and then we'll get through and see all the benefits. So in terms of Q&A, I had one particular question that I was going to ask the panel and then go to see whether or not we've got ones from the room. So, Amelia, there's a lot of chat at the moment about assurance. Can you clarify what the requirements are, the role of assurance standards here, and share any other assurance tips that you have?
It is a micro assurance engagement. It is only required over your greenhouse gas emissions disclosures, and it is clear in NZCS1 what the scope of that assurance engagement is. It does cover the methods and assumptions, etc., so don't forget about that. And it is a minimum of limited assurance. You may wish to do reasonable assurance if you so wish. Have that conversation with your assurance provider. And importantly, it is the choice of the climate reporting entity who can undertake that assurance engagement. It does not need to be your financial auditor. XRB standards only require that it is an independent and competent assurance practitioner, and those are principles included in our assurance standard. The assurance practitioner must use the XRB's assurance standard to undertake the assurance engagement. And in that assurance standard, we do state that it can be done under an ISO standard or what's called an ISAE standard. So there are options there. But yeah, so in terms of the principles around that assurance practitioner that you can use, they have to be independent and competent. And there's, for example, there's prohibitions on having financial interests, and they must have appropriate assurance skills, etc. But you can use any assurance practitioner, providing that they are competent. And we purposefully did this, knowing that it's a new regime, and there is an explosion of need out there in the market for people to do this work. So I absolutely agree with Michael's sentiments. Engage with your practitioner early, to make sure that you are understanding what the requirements are. But we are very clear that this is a small engagement. It might not seem small, but it's small compared to doing the entire climate statements, which is what is coming in Australia. And it can be done by anyone who is competent and independent.
Thank you very much. My understanding is also everybody should keep in mind materiality and the question of materiality for their business and what materiality means in a sustainability reporting and assurance context as opposed to a financial reporting context.
It's really interesting. Like, we are seeing internationally that materiality approach mean that fewer and fewer actually, topics and categories, for example, of emissions are being deemed material, because nobody wants an absolute overflow of information on hundreds and hundreds of pages about information that's actually not that material for the decision making of your primary user. So, one thing I didn't say, which I probably should have, because I say it normally every other time, is, this is about what is material to your primary user. So it's about engaging and knowing what is actually going to be useful information for their decision making. It's not what you think is material, it's what you understand they consider to be material.
Excellent, thank you very much. Carissa.
Amelia, I think you've kind of covered part of this question, so I'll just address what seems to be the second part of it in relation to assurance. How can assurance providers educate CREs that New Zealand does have the skills and people to assist along the journey?
I think it's that talking to each other thing again. This is a regime that is designed to engage every part of the organisation. It's not just about one sustainability practitioner, a lone one over there trying to, change the organisation. This is a strategy tool. It's about engaging with the board. It's about engaging with the senior leadership. And if that assurance practitioner can also come in and engage, that can be helpful. But I also echo what Jo said, this is not going anywhere. And so, can they look to explain what is happening in other jurisdictions, what the demands are. We have a great market here in New Zealand. There are a lot of really, really competent people who have been doing this work for a very long time, but they're not necessarily, in a firm that you've heard of. So, again, talk to each other, see if someone's got a great assurance practitioner that they're using and, has found helpful. I guess that would be, any other thoughts?
Yes. Oh, sorry. I think it's useful to make a distinction between what is for disclosures and what's for internal decision making, and sort of just be really clear with yourself. Like, there's a lot of information that will come through these processes that you might just want to use, to improve performance or to make choices in a different way. And I think sometimes if you feel like sometimes if you have kind of a compliance mindset for this and you're really focused on disclosing, then you kind of miss the wood for the trees in terms of how useful this information might be to different parts of your business, because you're just trying to sort of funnel it through that sustainability person and get that first report out. So maybe over time just take a step back and think, how actually might this be useful in different areas of the business where they might not have the same exposure as, the people preparing the reports.
Well, so Michael, and to you, Amelia. Michael, firstly, is the FMA going to be issuing any more guidance? And for Amelia, again, guidance, and where's the XRB's thinking as far as further standards? Are we going to be looking at nature-based disclosures? Are we going to be looking at human capital? Where are things expected to possibly go?
Yeah, so the only thing you're going to see from us in the immediate term is that monitoring report I mentioned earlier. So that's a sort of, detailing all of our findings. There will be some sort of, you can take guidance from it, I suppose, for what you should consider for year 2 and what you should improve on. But apart from that, there's nothing really coming out from our end on the agenda at the moment. If there's a need, if we, if people tell us we need this, etc., then we can consider it. But currently, there's nothing in the works apart from the monitoring report.
Same with the XRB. We really aim to be responsive. If there is a demand for a particular type of guidance, we really want to hear it, and we can either do something about it ourselves, work with a partner, or point you to guidance that might exist internationally. The next thing that's coming out from us is guidance on transition planning. So we published a Getting Started guide on transition planning, and I really do want to emphasise that I think the vast majority of what you need to get started is in that guide. But we are hoping to publish very shortly, co-published with the Institute of Directors, a guide targeted at directors around transition planning. That is, because one thing we do here is the need for directors to understand what this thing is and why it's important, and the fact that it's not just a little plan that kind of sits over here that's separate from your core strategy. It is an aspect of your core strategy. So that's coming. And we do hear questions around things like anticipated financial impacts, etc. But yeah, we really want to know. We don't want to overwhelm with guidance, because there is a lot. We did see some stuff coming from the International Sustainability Standards Board on financial impacts. We're talking to them about that guidance and how we think that might be relevant to the New Zealand market. And then other topics. Yeah, the big question we always get asked. So. You may have seen we've recently established the Sustainability Reporting Board. So that is a board with delegated authority from the External Reporting Board. That is the same as the NZASB and NZAUSB, our Accounting Standards Board and Audit and Assurance Board, and they do the technical standard setting, whereas the XRB board is kind of the more strategic governance body. And one of the key things that is on the agenda of that board is a consultation on a sustainability reporting policy position. So we are aiming to put that out in this financial year to really say, hey, this is what we think our policy position might be on sustainability reporting. These are our priorities. This is what we think about in terms of international alignment. But the point is we're putting that out as a consultation because we really want feedback on that. The International Sustainability Standards Board has, in their agenda priorities, identified 2 things. One is bees, not the things that fly around, but biodiversity, ecosystem and ecosystem services. And then 2, human capital. And those are research projects that they are doing to determine whether or not standard setting is required in those areas. So we're obviously paying a lot of attention to that. We engage with things like the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures. There's a new task force coming out, the Task Force on Inequality and Social Financial Disclosures, that we've been talking to. There's heaps and heaps and heaps of stuff. I cannot, underestimate, overestimate the amount of stuff going on. We only have a mandate to issue non-binding guidance on non-financial reporting on anything that is not climate. So there will be no mandatory standards coming from the XRB on anything other than climate.
Wonderful, thank you. Unfortunately, I'm going to need to call time, but I know each of you have always expressed that you're open to feedback, you're open to people contacting you, asking questions. If you don't feel comfortable doing that, for those of you who don't know me, I should have introduced myself at the beginning. Carissa Perano, Head of Regulatory Affairs for the Financial Services Council. Happy for you to send me through any questions anytime, and a quiet plug if you don't already have a member from your organisation on our Climate and ESG Committee. We do do frequently have our amazing panellists attend as guests, so great opportunity to continue learning there. So a huge thank you to each of you and your time and your expertise. Thank you.